IVM.
The Atheist's Confessions. At 13, I believed in rose petals, strewn at the earth god's feet. Agarbatti aromas made me heady, and I ate prasad only after a bath. At 14, my purse was slashed in the temple crowds. 14 and a half, and I began to wonder. The gods no longer smiled when I prayed. They couldn't. They were idols of stone. 15, and the Beatles became my gods. I grew heady on Chanel 25, ate fish fingers between sips of gin. On World Religion Day, I made a speech. God didn't exist, I said. I was 18 and worshipped myself. At 20, the rose petals were on my cheeks and in my hair and the bouquets he brought when he took me out to dinner. Then he took a blade and cut the flowers from their stems. I wilted. He grew heady on the scent. 22. I no longer worship myself or him. I look at the sculptures in the puja room and wonder, are the gods faintly beginning to smile again?
I remember listening to this poem for the first time in a class of 60 people. All of our girls huddled behind shared books and listening to this piece being read out dramatically by a professor, and something struck a chord. Was it the Beatles or the gin or the poetry or the person who wrote it? I could never find the answers until I got her into the studio. There is so much more to her than I could even sum up in an introduction, so we're going to take an entire episode to do that. I'm Laxmi Krishnan and you are listening to Lit Nama. After this short break, joining me is somebody who I revere a lot, somebody whose poetry I hold very, very dear to heart, Menka Shivdasani.
Remember the last vacation you took? What about the one you took 3 years ago? Okay, how much do you really remember? It's a question I've asked myself often over a decade of traveling the world. Hey, I'm Utsav and I do not travel the world for a living. I have a full-time job and responsibilities, but I have made traveling the world a priority. Priority enough that I negotiate extra leave in my job contracts, obsessively track my frequent flyer miles, and I'm willing to take off at the sight of a cheap ticket. Yes, I am cheap. I have lived and worked in 3 countries. I understand human behavior for a living. And these experiences have given me unique insights into places, people, and culture. With over a decade of travel behind me, I increasingly realized one thing, that we cannot see everything. So whatever we see, we must see deeply. Because as the film of memory decays, the imprints which will stand the test of time are the ones felt by the immersion of the senses, not by fleeting encounters with them. Postcards from Nowhere is an immersion into the world of slow travel, one story at a time. Tune in every Thursday on the IVM Podcasts app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Hello ma'am, welcome to the studio.
Hi Lakshmi, pleasure to be here.
I know that there's so much to talk about, so I'm going to structure my thoughts in 3, 2, 1. Okay. First things first, I'm in awe of your work. Like, just putting it out there. My entire class might be just listening to this podcast only because you've read The Atheist's Confession in the beginning. I don't know if it resonated with us in the beginning because we were a class in a time when everybody was debating all our belief systems. Because second year BA is a very prime time in your existential being, right? So on one side you're hearing Nietzsche go like, God is dead. On the other, you're reading like theories of logic and Indian logic, and you're just confused. And at that time, I think we held on to that poem to save us out of this moral dilemma that we had. But what was your story with poetry? How did you start writing poetry?
Well, I started when I was very young. I must say that The Atheist's Confessions, honestly, is not one of my own favorite poems.
Okay.
But it was the poem that they wanted, the university people wanted when they wanted a poem of mine in their textbook.
Correct.
And I tried to get them to take something else instead, but they said, no, this is the poem that we want for SYBA textbooks.
Correct.
So I started writing verse when I was about 6 or 8, maybe.
Wow.
I would not call it poetry because you just don't have the experience, obviously, at that
Correct.
age to be able to write anything of worth.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of these make-believe dogs and cats, and of course the sea was always there to write about, and the stars were there, and the sky was there. There was all these, nature that one could speak about without any real understanding or perception of anything.
Correct.
And I was really fortunate in that when I was about 9 or 10, my father he was a doctor, so he used to go to a particular house where there was this young lady called Rachika Kirpalani. She was a freelance journalist, and she asked me if I could show her my work.
Okay.
And when she read it, she asked my father for permission to get it published.
Oh.
And I believe she went around to different newspaper offices and told them that they must publish children's work and this particular poem, these particular poems.
Correct.
And they refused because they said, who is she, some child, why should we be interested? And then she got one newspaper to actually start a children's page. That's what I heard. That they started this page, and she got 5 or 6 of my poems published by the time I was 13. But she died very young. At the age of 26, she had a cerebral hemorrhage. So I could never repay that debt.
Yeah.
Which is very unfortunate. But that was my first experience of getting something in print.
Yeah.
And I continued writing through school. I was filling up notebooks, sitting in the back of the class, writing poems.
Very dream situation.
Yes. I'm sure you've done that too, all right?
Yeah.
So I had the benefit of meeting Nissim Ezekiel when I was very young. We had, of course, studied his poem, Night of the Scorpion.
Correct.
And somebody at the Times, he was the training officer, he gave me a letter to Nissim Ezekiel.
Okay.
And said, this girl, help her out, see what you can do. So I went to him with my best poems, what I thought were my best poems, written out in my perfect schoolgirl handwriting, and dressed in a sari because I couldn't let him know how young I was. And I went to the university where he had a room there, he was teaching, and showed him the letter very hesitantly, and he looked at the letter, looked at me, looked at the papers that I had in my hand, and then he just tossed them across the table and said, type them. I cannot judge poetry unless it is typed. Okay. Now, I'm talking about pre-computer days, right?
Yeah, it's so intimidating.
But he went out of his way. Before I left, he told me to write my name and my number and my address, and he kept it with him. And 2 weeks later, he called me.
Okay.
And he said, you were going to come back with your poems. What happened?
Wow.
And today, when I look back, Nissim Ezekiel is the one who really taught me so much about writing poetry. And these are debts you cannot repay in any way. You just have to pay them forward in whatever way you can.
And you most definitely paid it forward, because not only do you write for yourself, but you also edit anthologies. You also host the 100,000 Poets for Change Mumbai edition for so many years. You've hosted it for so many years. And you've created these platforms. You created Poetry Circle. And I think you've done more than just repaying the debt. There are so many that you inspired in classrooms and outside.
Thank
and
you.
I'm really happy. But I have a primary question at the core of it all. Do you still write about the sea and the sky?
Yes, but in different ways.
So how have you seen your poetry grow over time, over the years?
When I was much younger, I could write anywhere, anytime. I used to write on the backs of bus tickets. I used to write on my palm and then not wash my hand for as long as I could avoid, washing it. And today, when I think more and write less, I'm not prolific at all. I do not wish to be prolific because I think sometimes one writes too much and then it's not always something that you should make public.
Correct.
And today I find people are very quick to publish their work, and especially with the internet. It's a dangerous trend, I think.
Correct.
So I think you need to let a poem mature before you let it out to the world.
There's this very beautiful metaphor I had read about how poem actually grows in you before it's supposed to grow out of your hands, because it's like that plant. You sow the seed, you let it simmer around, you let the flavors, like it's like making chai. It's a process, right? But that being said, you started writing when you were 13.
Earlier.
No, you got published when you were 13.
I was 8 when my first poems appeared in print.
Wow. So was getting your poems in print, of course, in newspaper was not that easy, but what was your first book? Like, when did you compile all of your poems into a book?
My first book was actually 10 years after I initially met Nissim Ezekiel. So I met him when I was 16. It was probably more than that because it was in 1990, I think, that my first book appeared.
Okay.
And by then, Nissim and I were meeting every week and he was asking me, don't you want to publish your book? And I said, I'm not in a hurry. I don't care. I don't want to be, in a rush with this because I have to be comfortable with what I'm putting out there.
Yeah.
And finally, when I said, okay, now I'm ready, he started applauding and said, oh, finally this girl is ready to publish. Fantastic,
But you were really lucky to get Nissim as a guide, because now that we hear stories, like as students, we heard stories of him teaching at Elphinstone in Mumbai, and we always thought that we were so close but so far, because like we were generations apart from him, but it still feels like he lives in this collective consciousness of English poetry, in like Indian English poetry as it goes on.
Yes, he was a very important figure because he was the one who actually brought in a whole new
trend.
A new language for
Correct.
Indian English poetry.
I remember reading Soap as a part of our curriculum, and initially we were like, oh, and then we realized there are so many layers to his writing that don't come off in the first go. You have to really kind of devour his poetry to reach that core of it.
Yeah, his very Indian English poems are the ones that are, of course, the most popular.
Correct.
But he had far more
better ones.
Yes, he had the poet Lava Bird Watcher is I think everybody's favorite, really.
It's like a universal favorite. Like any English literature classroom is incomplete without him. I think that's the same I felt with Eunice D'Souza as well.
Yes.
Because she was teaching at Xavier's for a really long time, until she passed away, in fact. And we were told that she teaches there. She founded Ithaca, and we could never actually meet her. So it always feels like meeting our literary idols has been a dream, and they've been so close it so far.
I was really fortunate in that respect because in the mid-70s, when I was opening my eyes to a whole new world of Indian English poetry, these were the poets who were bringing out new forms of writing, new forms of looking at the world. Adil Jassawala told me that D.N. Road was a fit subject for poetry.
Okay.
Which is something that you could not imagine in a romantic era of, poetry writing about
when you were like
stars
getting drunk on daffodils.
Yes,
in
absolutely.
Your syllabi.
Absolutely.
I can't imagine going from daffodils to D.N. Nagar, to be very honest. D.N. Road, yeah.
Yeah, what happened was that there was always this criticism about writing in English.
Correct.
Why can't you write in your mother tongue? That was the question that really irritated everybody because, they were writing in the language that they were comfortable in.
Yeah.
And they were making English their own.
Yeah.
I
remember Kamala Das's an introduction talks about this, the queerness, the otherness.
Yes.
It's all mine and mine alone. And but you've also written and you've also created an anthology of poetry in partition when people are not really talking about partition literature on the mainstream. Through poetry, majorly.
That's right. I belong to a community that has suffered because of partition and not just suffered but also lost the language and the culture as a result. Yeah. So in the, I think mid or late 80s, we started working on this. I was working with a poet called Anju Makhija who also wrote in English. And we contacted Dr. Arjun Shad Mirchandani, who was a poet who had lived through partition.
Okay.
He was a professor at Jai Hind College when I was a student there. And we started at point zero. We knew nothing. We knew nothing about the folk tales. We knew nothing about what they had really suffered.
Correct.
And we discovered that there were many poets who had been through horrific experiences, but they were not talking about it because it was too traumatic. There was this whole sense of cultural amnesia that happened. So poets who'd actually written poems about partition told us that they had no poems about partition.
Oh.
And then Arjun Shad found poems from his personal collection.
Correct.
And 4 years we worked on this anthology. And later, when it was launched at the Jai Hind College, There was a Marathi poet in the audience whom we didn't know. Niranjan Uskare was in the front row. And he told us afterwards that he did not know that an entire community had suffered so much. He thought of himself as very culturally aware.
Yeah.
But he did not know that so many people had suffered and were not talking about it.
Exactly.
So
but even again, when we talk about partition, prose is put up front instead of poetry, because you talk about your mantos and your chuktas and your Kushman Singhs. But it was surprising when I found out that poetry itself was so rich around partition, and poetry as a form itself is more dense and more poignant when you talk about it.
The Sindhi story generally tends to get neglected.
Correct, yeah.
It's more about, the Punjabi story, or in fact, even that big partition event that happened there was a huge event on partition in Mumbai.
Okay.
And when I looked at the schedule, I asked them, but where is the Sindhi story in all this?
Correct, yeah.
And I had done some interviews with Sindhi writers, some of whom are no longer with us. I'd gone to the Institute of Sindhology in Adipur.
Okay.
And spoken to some of these writers who were in the 70s and 80s trying to reclaim that culture and heritage. And it still exists. They're doing fantastic work there. And
but yet again, these places, even if culturally when we talk about them, are reserved to certain pockets in the city. So to even bring that from there to the mainstream is a huge task, because did you work in translation for this anthology as well, or were people writing in English?
No, I spoke to them in my broken English, Hindi, Sindhi combination.
Okay.
And they would smile indulgently and, speak to me in English.
Yeah.
But see, the thing is that because our generation did not have any access to the language or the culture, there are pockets where they do speak Sindhi in India. But there are large groups of people who do not speak the language because there is this whole, trickle-down effect. The first generation that has lived through partition obviously has very strong memories of it. Okay. So they will influence the second generation. But by the time it's got to the third generation, it's lost. And Sindhis had to go around the world to rebuild their lives, really.
Correct.
So in that process, they adjusted and they made themselves fit in wherever they found a home. And as a result, they lost a very, very key part of their being. And I'm glad to see there is now a resurgence. Young people are trying to reclaim their culture. When we were working on this book, no one was really talking about it, like we said. But we did find young poets who were writing about what they felt they had been lost. Bimi Sadrangani, Mahesh Ninwani. People like them were writing about something that they felt that they should have had claim to.
Correct.
And didn't.
I was speaking to a family friend of mine, and this idea of hometown that comes through in other languages and cultures and poetry, because I just casually, they were talking about how people ask them, where are you from? And they can't really always directly answer that question, because as a second generation migrant, from a family that has migrated to India, they don't know. So most of the times they can't trace their roots back to, in India, this idea of a hometown is very prevalent.
Yes,
right?
I used to wonder in school as well when my friends said, I'm going to my hometown. I said, what is that?
Yeah. And I assume most of my friends also used to talk about, so we were technically cut off from my hometown, and when people say hometown, I used to think, okay, the town where they have their houses, which is not where they usually stay, because where you stay is your hometown, was a very obvious connection. But then you realize there are such cultural depths to these things. So when coming to the actual aspect of creating an anthology, you worked on both the fronts. You've written personal poetry for so long, and then you've also created anthologies. How does the process generally work? I'm always curious what goes on in a head of the editor, and how does their brains work when it comes to that?
See, I've done 2 anthologies for the webzine bigbridge.org.
Correct.
And
one for Sparrow, a series
one for Sparrow. That was women writing.
Correct.
So I think it is a very enriching experience to listen to other people's work.
Correct.
Because when you are writing, you are completely within yourself.
Right.
and you have nothing to do with anything because you just want to be alone
Yeah.
and listen to that voice in your head, which is so elusive.
Correct.
And when you're editing an anthology, you are bringing in other people's very diverse voices. But I think the common thing is that when you're looking at what you should include in an anthology and what you should leave out,
Yeah.
it is the uniqueness of the voice
Correct.
that matters. It is how you are saying things that all of us really know. I mean, what are we're talking about the same things. We're talking about love. We're talking about fear. We're talking about,
The
the
sea and the
emotions.
sky.
The sea and the sky. But how are you saying it differently?
Correct.
So that is a very, very difficult thing to do. And that is what makes a poem unique and special.
And then gets it a spot in an anthology.
Yeah.
But now something very interesting that you just said about how you need to listen to different voices. So when you were writing, growing up, how connected were you with your contemporaries? Because today when a poet is writing and posting and publishing online, like as frequently as possible, they have a lot of contemporaries who they can follow and listen to and are equally vocal. But when you were writing, did you know other people writing around? Like, how did you connect to them? How did you have a network of your own?
So in the 70s, I kept hearing that no one was interested in poetry, that there was no platform available. There was the pen office, which Nissim Ezekiel ran. So Theosophy Hall, once a month, there would be these readings. And at the most, you'd have, on a very, very good day, there would be 40 people. And that was like absolutely the maximum, that you could expect ever at a poetry reading. And I just took it for granted that poetry was not something that people were interested in. But in 1986, a friend of mine came to me. He was actually my professor at Jai Hind College. We'd become friends.
Okay.
Nitin Mukaddam. He's no longer with us.
So, yeah.
He came to me and asked me, is there an audience for poetry? And I said, well, I've been told there isn't. So he said, but can we find an audience? Are there people who may be interested?
Yeah.
So what had happened was another friend of his, Akhil Contractor, had published these books. Spirit Song there were 2 very slim volumes.
Okay.
And Akhil was wondering if there were audiences for what he had written.
Correct. Yeah.
So the 3 of us sat down at a restaurant called Parisian Cafe at Fort, which was very close to my office those days. I used to work for a newspaper. And we talked about the possibility of starting an organization.
Correct.
And because Nitin belonged to the advertising world, he said, look, this is all pre-computers, right?
Yeah.
So you can
I was
just
just
create
mentally
logos and
imagining,
banners and things.
Yeah, you can't just start a Facebook page and expect people to
Correct.
just join it.
So he said, look, if, you poets don't think about these things, but the fact is that if you put some kind of logo there, some kind of letterhead, people will take you seriously.
Correct, yeah.
You send a letter to a newspaper announcing an event, and it's on a letterhead. They will publish it. You will get your audience. So that's what he created these logos and other materials for us. And we had our first event at the Kama Hall.
Okay, yeah.
And we were always very ambitious. We had no money, obviously, but we were young. We were ambitious.
I think that is one thing that has not changed with poetry till date.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. But spaces were difficult to find. You didn't have all the cafes that exist today.
Correct. And the cafes were also not like open to whatever existed was not accessible as much, or was it different back in the day?
Well, of course, you had the UDPs that you could go to, the Irani restaurants
Yeah.
where you would meet and discuss the world.
Correct.
But in terms of organizing events, like you could go to a particular, a well-known cafe today and say, I want to organize something, and they may give you the space. But there was nothing like that. So at that time when we started the Poetry Circle, Nitin was working for a corporate. The first meeting was held in his conference room.
Okay.
We had no room to sit. We had no room to stand. And people had come with their poems.
Wow.
And they wanted to share their work. And there were people who were bankers. There were people who were customs officers. people
So are
who are
you telling
working
me
with
the first open mic in India happened in 1986?
It actually wasn't an open mic. It was it was more an administrative meeting. Sorry to say that, but that
yeah.
was, we had to work how this was going to go.
Otherwise, I was just going to be like, this is a
No.
universal declaration that the first habitat of Mumbai existed in 1986. Y'all are too late to the
But
party.
we had after that we had meetings with. The idea was to organize events where there would be one well-known poet.
Okay.
And 2-3 of us who were not well known, who were not known at all, and hopefully the well-known poet would bring in the audiences that we were trying to reach out to. So that first year, because we were optimistic and we always believed things would work if you allowed the universe to make it work for you. So Dom Horace had just come back from, he was in Bombay. He had been in a 17-year hibernation, poetic hibernation. And I called him. Somebody gave me, I think somebody gave me his address, and I just went to his house and asked him. I forget now, but we asked if he would read at our event, at our inaugural event.
Yeah.
And he said yes. And it was his first reading in 17 years. I have a recording of that somewhere, an audio recording, actually. Because those days we didn't have photographs, so easily as we do today. But Dom read, and then Nissim did an event with us later, and there were other poets who came, and we had 100 people that first day.
Wow.
Which
I'm really glad that podcast is an audio medium because people can't see my face right now. I'm just gobsmacked. Like there is all of these people I've read growing up, and to imagine them just. I think nothing has changed with poetry because that's how we also connected. Like this one day I wrote to you saying, I'm doing a podcast. Would you like to be a part of it? And I did not believe you'd say yes. Because
I'm honored.
I was telling my producer Madhuri that, listen, I've written to a poet who's somebody that I've studied. Like I've written answers on her poetry. I don't know if she's going to agree, but let's see. I think internet has made it a lot easier for you to access, but for you to pull this 100 people in a room back in the day is a major feat to achieve.
But I must say that this was always teamwork. It wasn't just one person, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes the difference. I think Poetry Circle, as we developed, there were poets who, were very good. There were poets who were not so good, but we gave each other feedback, and that was the point, to try and strengthen the work that was being written.
So did all of this work with Poetry Circle or with your contemporaries affect how you were writing? Like, did you start looking at your poetry in a very different sense?
Of course. Because I think to write a poem is a very difficult thing in the sense that most of us, like to believe that it's just something spontaneous overflow.
Yeah, of powerful emotions, often recollected
it is
in
not.
tranquility.
It is not. You need to get back to the poem. You need to revise it. And this is again, in my early days, I learned a lot from Nissim about the importance of craft.
Correct.
And one of the very important things that he told me was, forget about the grand philosophies of poetry. Yeah. First, get your grammar right.
Yeah, I agree.
And once you know the rules, you can break them.
This should be the gospel.
Oh yeah, and I actually worked out a few rules that worked for me personally over the years. There were 5 sort of cardinal principles that worked for me. I don't know, they'll work for everybody, but they were important in my process. And I think a lot of people are not, they just want to be published as soon as they write their poem. And they want to be bringing out their books as soon as they've got 2 years worth of writing. And I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea for people to publish too soon. Because your first book is what you will be identified with all your life. And if you make mistakes with that, and you regret what you did.
Exactly, yeah.
It'll be a calling card for you initially. It'll be something you can show off. See, I wrote this book of poems. Yeah. But if it's not going to be taken seriously, what is the point?
That's where my next, question, I wouldn't say, but the next point that I was looking for was the fact that you've not stayed like one of the poet who only writes for the page anymore. You've also kind of traversed into with 100,000 Poets for Change and with other events that you curate. You've always held a mix of people on your curation panel. Some of them are slam poets, some of them are poets who've been writing exclusively for performance in theatre. Some write for the stage. Some are hardcore people who write only to get published and don't really perform their poems. So you always stayed on top of these trends that happened around the city. What is that significant change that you're seeing in the current space of poetry? What's exactly happening?
Today, I think with this whole spoken word movement that has become so strong, I think there is a lot of activism in the poetry.
Correct, yeah.
Now, sometimes I worry that this can just be reduced to sloganeering, where the poem is lost as a result, and you just want to talk about issues. It is important to talk about these issues
but
as
it's not
poets.
that issues were not being spoken about before, right? Like when you all were also writing page poetry, like say from Nissim or to
Of course.
Don Moraes, everybody had their politics in their poetry.
Of course, but the access was not always as strong as you would have wanted it to be.
Yeah.
For a page poem, you have to sort of sit down with the book and read it in your own space.
Yeah.
And today there are all these platforms where people are just, spouting poetry on open mics.
On 2 camera setups.
Yeah. And I think it's a good thing that poets are actively engaging with the kind of world that we are living in. It is important to be raising your voice against certain things that are happening.
Yeah.
And poets speak the truth.
Correct.
That is one thing that you cannot tell a lie in a poem. Because a poem comes from a very deep space inside you. And
which is why I feel like patience is also a very important aspect of poetry.
Yes.
Just as we put a lot of pressure on editing as a concept, I think letting that poem brew in for a while before you go live with it.
Earlier, I used to not allow my poems to be out until I lived with them for some 5 years. Today, I realize I don't have that luxury. So
world moves too fast for 5 years.
But yeah, I mean, the average time between my books has been 10 years, 12 years.
Okay, yeah.
And today when people tell me that, 2-3 publishers have told me that when your next manuscript is ready, you bring it to us. And I don't know if there'll be another book. Who knows?
Please let there be another book.
10 years, 12 years. But I do think that one should be slow and let the poems find their own space.
Correct.
Because after a point, they're not you. They are separate from you. They come through you. But they have their own existence.
That's a very poignant truth, because when you put something on page, you can't really say how's the other person reading it. Like, am I supposed, if I'm to read the same poem, The Atheist Confession, that you read in the beginning of the conversation, I would probably read it a little differently than you did. Right? So you never know how the listener is going to, or the reader is going to pick up on your nuances of writing.
That's right. And the same poem will get very positive reviews and very negative reviews. So finally it boils down to your sense of balance as a writer, knowing what works, what doesn't, and being your own best critic.
True.
And that comes only through experience and through reading and through listening to other voices and understanding.
I agree. There's a very interesting thing that you told me before we even went live, that whenever you're reading poems, you like to read from different times, like different periods of your life when you were writing, to kind of give a journey. And I think that's a very, very beautiful way of also looking at your own growth over time or your own progress, because you also know where you came from and you also know where you're going. And I really, really hope that there is another book to see what's currently happening. Because it's really interesting to talk to page poets in the time when everything is so fast on the internet. How do you get that patience to sit like when I imagine a page poet writing, I imagine like a beautiful window, a desk underneath.
Not at all.
And then I realized that's not how it works. That works only in like Virginia Woolf's books. That doesn't really work in real life. Do you have like a ritual or like a process before you sit down to write? It's such a stupid question.
I wish I had that discipline. I'm told it is very effective, that people who spend, maybe a certain set number of hours every morning with poetry, I'm sure that is very effective, but I unfortunately have never done it. And it's a great concept. I keep saying I wish I had the luxury of sitting 7 to 9 a.m. I will just focus on my poetry.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen. Because especially when you're a woman, you have to juggle so many things. You're always interrupted. You always got something else to do that has nothing to do with poetry.
Yeah.
And you're trying to navigate that space and find your voice in the middle of all that cacophony, and it's not always easy.
Yeah. So when you were also writing, I just thought about it because you brought up the point of being a woman poet. When you were being, like, you're writing the times when Dawn Mora is writing or say Nissim is writing, do you feel like the gender bias that we talk about in poetry, or the kind of discrimination we talk about in the activism that comes along with poetry, was it disappointing back in the day? Was it better? Was it worse? Or were you a poet before you were anything else?
Well, whenever Tom wrote about me, which he did a few times, he always put the word woman poet before it. And one day I asked him, I said, why do you have to specify that? And he said, but it is different, isn't it? Women poets are different from male poets. And I said, today my position on this is that, yes, I can understand where certain poets come from when they say they don't want to be labelled as women poets, because labels are always dangerous.
Always.
Labels will just put you into a slot that is not necessarily true at all. But today, okay, I do write a lot of poetry that is woman-centric.
That is about female experience.
Yes. And I don't have a problem being called a woman poet, because I don't think that it is something to be defensive or apologetic about.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm a poet. Yes, I write about women's issues. Yes, I think they need to be heard. And so what? But I'm not going to apologize for the fact that I'm writing like a woman.
Because you sit on a very beautiful intersection that, activist poetry or just activism in general talks about, because you come from a community that has a history of losing its own voice or its own sense of self.
Yeah.
And from there, for you to write about being a woman from that position means a lot more than just writing about the sky and the seas, because those become your vehicles for you to transplant your emotions.
Actually, a lot of my woman-centric poetry, I try to understand where it came from, especially in the early days. So as a young journalist, this was in the mid-80s when I was working for a newspaper. I was the editor of the women's pages.
Correct. Yeah,
and
I remember that.
This was the UN Decade of Women, so there was a lot of activity happening in Mumbai. And I chose to write about women's issues, where my editor, BCB, where I'm contracted, he wanted me to write about fashion and cookery, and I said there is so much newsprint at our disposal, you cannot waste it on fashion and cookery.
Yeah.
Eventually we compromised, and I brought in a little of the fashion and cookery to sort of get the readers in.
Yeah.
And then talked about other issues like injectable contraceptives or dowry deaths and things like that that were very much a part of the discourse at that time. So for 4 years, that's the kind of writing I was doing. And I met women from across the spectrum who were subjected to domestic violence, who were, and not just in India. I interviewed someone who was a radio talk show host in the US.
Okay.
And she said, I did this episode on wife beating and realized it was America's biggest secret.
Wow.
So these were things that somehow found their way into the poetry through a process of osmosis. I cannot sit down and say, okay, now I'm going to write a poem about violence towards women. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But they certainly came in the writing in ways that were unexpected. Completely random things. There's a poem of mine that became a signature poem from the first book. It's called Why Rabbits Never Sleep.
Okay.
And that afternoon I'd read something about lettuce. Some random newspaper article saying lettuce is a natural sedative. It puts you to sleep. If you're having trouble sleeping, you eat lettuce and you'll be fine. And somehow those connections happen. Lettuce, rabbit. And suddenly I was talking about women being burnt alive.
Yeah.
About Nazis. Suddenly I was bringing in all that. And I don't know where it came from, but that osmosis that happens is very important.
Yeah. I think it's also the fact that your craft itself, it speaks a lot more about your craft, because to even form that connection, you need that much practice, you need that much of reading, because I don't know how you could connect a lettuce to a Nazi. Like, you require some connection skills to pull those strings together.
But you don't know where they come from.
Correct.
There's something, some chemistry happening that you're not even aware. You're going about your daily life. You're doing whatever you need to do. Today I'm cooking. I'm working on other things that will bring me money that have nothing to do with poetry. And there's always something that is connecting inside that
Poetry is
finally
always brewing.
ignites. Yeah, it finally, when it's ready to come out, it will.
Yeah.
But that's where the importance of craft in your early stages
Correct. Yeah.
was so vital. That Nissim was talking to me about learning the craft
Grammar,
at those days. And I used to fight with him about this. I said, what does it matter if there's a comma missing or a full stop missing or capital that should be there and it's not. And he said, no, you don't realize that these are things that once they are inside you, you're not even thinking about them. Then you get on with the real business of writing a poem.
Yeah. And I think that brings us to a brilliant junction where I'm just going to take a very short break and we're going to come back to listen to your poetry across time.
Great.
Hey everybody, welcome to another amazing week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and HDFC Life. Remember, sponsors make these shows possible. Do show them your appreciation. And if you own a brand or work for a brand or are associated with a brand and think that brand would benefit from working with IVM, do reach out to us. You can find contact information on our website. Also, just a very quick note, I would really appreciate it if you guys could fill out a really short survey on our website. It's on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It's just a brand recognition survey for us to kind of work with the advertisers and give them some data. So it's a very short, less than 1 minute survey. Really appreciate your help in filling it out. So people, we have a new show releasing this week. It's called Begin the Journey. It's hosted by national award-winning film actor and motivational speaker Ashish Vidyarthi. He shares inspiring stories from various aspects of life. Stay tuned. First episode comes out on Monday, the 2nd of March. On Advertising is Dead, Varun does another AMA episode where he answers some questions sent in by listeners about advertising and content. He also gets some of his previous guests to give their takes on the questions. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus is joined by Laxmi Krishnan, host of Litnama, to talk about her show and her love for literature. Also, check out Cock and Bull, which came out on Thursday last week. Cyrus is joined by Rohan Gujral, myself, and Silvery. We discuss Donald Trump's visit to India, we debate broccoli samosas, and discuss the case of a crocodile in Mulund. Also, if you haven't been doing it, please do send AMA questions for Cyrus and Varun shows. Every episode of Cyrus has an AMA segment, and Advertising is Dead is going to have one once a month. On IVM Likes, Ritika, Radhika, and Antriksh are joined by the co-host of the Edges and Sledges cricket podcast, Dhananjay Chak. They talk about the T20 Women's World Cup and discuss movies which portray women in sports. On The Habit Coach, Ashton talks about the best way to work on your hands and exercise them. On Edges and Sledges, DJ, Ashwin and Varun talk about India's great run at the T20 Women's World Cup and the New Zealand versus India Test. On Ganatantra, Saryu and Alok are joined by Rahul Verma of the Centre for Policy Research. They discuss how Indian voters vote along the lines of ideology and identity. On the Empowering series, Zarina is joined by Khushbu Benani. She is the content and marketing lead at Diageo India, and they talk about storytelling with brands. On Litnama, Laxmi is joined by the musician Ritviz and his artist manager Rahul Sinha. They talk about coming-of-age music and their albums. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Welcome back after this really short break. You can clearly see how excited I was because we spoke a lot about what pieces would ma'am read throughout the entire time of the break. But finally, I believe she's shortlisted pieces from Frazil, which is her book that's out, which you should get. But I think I'll let her do more of the talking over me. Yeah, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Laxmi. So, Frazil is actually, I did not call it collected works.
Okay.
But it does have poems from all my previous books.
Correct.
And some new poems. Because my publisher said they were out of print for a long time, so we needed to collect them and, bring them out there because people didn't have access to my work.
Yeah, I've saved my SYBA textbook because I don't want to lose out on the atheist confession.
Really?
Yeah, I should have got my copy to get it signed. I regret it.
You can get Frazil, maybe.
Yes, I'll get that signed from you then. Over to you.
So over the last, how long has it been? I won't even say how long it's been because it's been too long. But I've been writing poetry, like I said, from the time I was 8, and verse, really, not poetry. But the first poem that marked the transition from childhood writing to what I hoped was more mature work was a poem called Paper Smiles when I was 16. And I'm just reading this to show the actual work that went in, the craft that went in. This is a poem I worked on with Nissim in those early days.
Wow.
And it's very short, but there were certain lessons I learned there about writing that were important. So I'll read the poem and I'll tell you what the difference was.
Okay.
Paper smiles. The mask does not fall to reveal the damned expected self. Some withdraw, others miss the point. None comes near to rip it off till the paper smiles are slashed. I wait alone, seeing silence fall on a painted wall. Now, when I first wrote this poem, I wrote others misunderstand. And he read it and he said, but you realize it's a very short poem. It cannot hold the weight of a word like misunderstand. So you can say the same thing with using shorter words that are far more effective. And that's where others miss the point came in.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a... Wow, this is like a poetry masterclass straight up, because the weight of the words is such a brilliant concept, because people don't realize, like, we put in all these highly powered jargonistic terms in our writing, and we don't even think if our poetry is like thick enough or fragile enough, what is exactly happening with the form when we are writing. Yeah.
So one trick is to always read it aloud. When you've written a poem, keep it aside for some time and then go back to it and read it aloud and see if it works in the way you thought it worked on the page.
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to remember that pro tip.
So around the same time, there was a poem that I wrote called Crystal, which, well, it was sort of introduction, I guess, to me. Yeah. I was 16 when I did this. Crystal. For all its glitter, diamond is only carbon. Never mind differences in price, quality, prestige. Carbon, they said, was black, ugly. So they changed the refractive index, used it as lead to shoot graphitic holes in paper mass. Then realized it could be polished to still greater purposes and made what we call a diamond. The softness gradually became hard. Today, only another diamond can cut me. I was always very bad at science, but yeah, that whole the different forms of carbon suddenly came in very useful.
I think that was one thing everybody remembers from their science class, thanks to the beautiful diagrams that we were forcibly made to draw.
Yes. But I don't even know how these morphed into the poem and how it worked, but there it was. And
it's formed a covalent bond. Sorry, I'm also really, really bad at science jokes.
So I'll just read one more poem from that period when I was about 16. This one is called Hinges. I was not too well in those days, and I spent a lot of my final year in bed rest. And, that's the time I wrote this poem. Hinges. I found my body hinged like any other door. It could open and close with just a push. It had been pushed too often. One hinge was insecure, the other firm as iron. No tool seemed to work when I tried unhinging myself, and carpenters charged exorbitant rates. So I decided to leave it where it was. Now I'm building another body for myself.
If I was writing like even 5% of this good writing when I was 16, I think I would have been like a published poet by this time. Oh God, you're so good with this.
Thank you. I must tell you that as it happened, my first book was published by Adil Jassawala, who had initially, when I was a young journalist, and with Midday, I'd interviewed him, and he'd said young people ruin my pleasure at seeing a new book by insisting on showing me their manuscripts. So I'd made this, vow that I would never show him my work until it was published.
Yeah.
And as it happened, he ended up publishing my first book.
Circle of life.
Just sheer chance that he said, I heard that you have a manuscript, can I see it? I met him on the road and he said, so Adil told me that when he published my work, he said, people who don't know you will think that here is this person who's either an alcoholic or a drug addict. They won't believe that you're this journalist who works long, horrible hours and
still manages to find poetry out of it.
Yeah, I was working 14 hours a day, 12 hours a day was the normal thing. And, I was writing. And so this poem is called Spring Cleaning, also from my first book. I think this is one of the poems that had him make this remark. So Spring Cleaning. That was your skull on the bottom shelf, staring socketless at my ankle. It was a surprise find among those bunches of old clothes. Once I would have screamed. Now I've learnt to discard what doesn't fit, and especially all that's ugly. Carelessly draped on a hanger, I found an arm leaning bonily towards the perfumes. In another corner, a dislocated knee. Did you run away so fast you broke your leg? I wish you'd wipe that foolish, toothless grin off your stupid face. You needn't be embarrassed about letting me down. Other men have too. And they didn't disintegrate like you. What the hell does one do with human remains? Should I put them in the wastebasket and let the sweeper see? Or, struggling under the weight, dump a gunny bag off the beach? You really are a nuisance turning up on a lethargic Sunday. Now go away. When I want to say hello, I'd rather walk up to the graveyard with a sweet-smelling bunch of flowers, look sad, and pretend you are still below the earth. So,
when the poem started, I was going to say something like, oh, you're the Mary Kondo of before your times. But then I realized, no, this cleaning means something completely different. Am I supposed to be scared? I don't know. I have nothing to say about the amount of range, right from like the door hinge to a cemetery.
But then I've been writing a long time. So there was one poem that survived the 2 years on my first job, and it was about being a sub-editor.
Okay.
And it was called Stet. Now, I don't know if today's generation will know the process of printing a newspaper where, before computers,
Okay.
where you went through a galley, and if you wanted to remove something, but then you changed your mind, you would use the word Stet.
Okay.
So, as in retain it, do not let it go.
Okay, yeah, got it.
So this was the only poem that survived those 2 years when I was working for a newspaper in my first job. Stet. 1 year of marking paragraphs and time, deleting words, adding commas, rewriting the homeopathy and gardening columns. 1 year of fungus sprouting from ears, eyes, tongue. 1 year of feeling like mouldy bread, full of holes. Good to collect monthly 4-figure pay, buy a new pair of jeans, hide the fungus growing on the thigh. Till you feel like a bit of copy yourself, cleaned, pruned, computer processed in black and white, tucked away on the inside pages of a world you never made. Turn to the original. Some sub-editor there marked it Stet.
Okay, there are two things I say a lot on the show. One is the word correct, and second is the fact that I need to get a line tattooed. Because some lines are so beautiful. Like, you are a copy yourself is something like I would put on a green board that would inspire me for days to come. Thank you so much. This is so beautiful.
Thank you. Then much later, as I was maturing as a writer, as a woman, trying to figure out what freedom meant to me, what one has to give up to get that freedom, and yet how important it is to find that space in your life. So I wrote a poem called Tea Party. This is how it goes. When you and I were about to break, there was no question of a fight over who would take the cups and who the saucers. You spilled over with steam, meniscus rippling with the slightest touch. I, supine on the floor, licked the milk once meant for you. Both of us were China at that point. One of us had been to China too, known the meaning of porcelain freedoms, sniffed red guards. One of us had known the sound of an alien tongue, harsh and guttural as it came from smiling mouths. Our smiles were circular, yours and mine. Yours from the top of the T and mine below. Two halves joined together on separate rims. When we blew at each other, the crockery stayed firm. And who but you and I would know the liquid moved? No, there was no fight over chipped white glass. The pieces lay upon the kitchen floor. And I've moved to tea parties in other living rooms, balancing alien porcelain on a frigid palm. Around this time, I had lived in Hong Kong. I just got myself a job there with the newspaper and stayed there for a while, and I did not like it and I came back. So I was at the Poland monastery. It didn't actually, they were building what was dubbed as the world's largest Buddha at that time. Today it's a very, it's a very busy tourist spot. Yeah. But the time that I was there, they were building it, and I was sitting there watching the workers, and there were these monks walking around, and I wrote this poem. At Poland, Lantau. In the monastery to which I do not belong, high in the clouds where Buddha smiles, a strange, ferocious statue looks down on me as the joss sticks lose themselves. A shaven monk, going out of his mind, slings a careless arm around me. And I wonder what it's like to make love to a monk. Wonder what it's like to make love to you again. And you. Once the God who did not belong to me have come back like a prayer wheel, and slowly the thudding begins, drumming out from the heart into the monastery of my mind. Tourist voices bulldoze through stone. High on the monastery where clouds converse, before silence is spread like joss stick ash leaving their fragrance behind. Were you the Buddha I used to know? Why then did you teach discontent? The eightfold path we walked together was so full of thorns and sediment. Where are you now as the aliens pass? Are you gently rotating away? Will you come back to this monastery? Teach me how to pray.
Wow. The monastery of mind is an imagery I don't think I'm going to forget for a really, really long time.
So there are different kinds of poems that I've been writing about certain issues now. And of course, women will always be a large theme. There was a time when I used to think God was a large theme and my search for God. But I realized that really wasn't what was happening. So more recently, I wrote this poem called Kites. Okay. And during the US elections, you remember there was a reference to Hillary Clinton being such a nasty woman.
Yeah.
And I wrote this around Makar Sankranti in Mumbai.
Okay.
Kites. Kites are flimsy, fragile, decorative, paper-thin, bearing their wooden cross, biding their time in airless drawers, hidden away from the sky. Kites are nasty, like women. Sharp-edged they fly against the clouds, bite into your hand. The threads they bear have hidden shards of glass, unfurling as they gauge the weft of wind. You who stand on the parapet edge, believing you hold the strings, look up where it hovers and rustles. kites are nasty. They soar, they tug against the reins, catch the nearest squall and disappear. You will only be left with a stinging hand and an empty space above. There was a time when I started thinking that the only time anyone spoke to a woman was if someone had to be fed or someone had to be paid. And I had this sudden, very strong image of all the machines suddenly just curling back, suddenly stopping, all the wires pulling back from their plug points. So this poem started in a very different way, but became something else as I wrote it.
Okay.
It's called The Clinging Vine.
Okay.
And it uses an image of something without actually referring to that.
To that image.
The clinging vine. Put her in cold storage. Let the grey metallic doors shut upon her. She will taste good when the time is right. Toss her into boiling water, so red and soft, till the skin splits and the juices ooze. De-seed her, gently roast the flesh. A bit of garlic is always good, roughly minced, spluttering in hot oil. For perfect partners, try some ginger shreds. Lastly, put her into the shiny processor. Choose the blade with care to ensure the texture's right. Chunky bits are perfect for the salads, but puring makes her smoother down the throat. Appetizer? Main course? Take your pick. Let dessert wait. And
I'm officially speechless, so I'm just going to let you read and finish.
Okay, I will read one last poem, which is on a slightly lighter note. It's called The Woman Who Speaks to Milk Pots.
Okay.
Now, if you are a woman running a house, you probably know what your morning is going to look like. You will be boiling the milk packets as soon as they come in.
Yeah.
You will be boiling yesterday's leftover milk so that it doesn't get spoiled. And you will be boiling the milk again in the afternoon because, you don't want the morning milk to get spoiled.
Right,
and this just goes on. And, women's lives are just so packed with just these pointless, repetitive tasks that need to be done. And, of course, when you're watching that pot, it's never going to boil, right? I mean,
and the moment you step away from it, it's going to just pour
push,
over.
it's all out there. You
Yeah.
know? So I suddenly, one day, I found myself speaking to the milk pot.
Okay.
The woman who speaks to milk pots. Boil! I shall ignore that steely glint and watch you. I am simmering too, padding about with cotton ball claws, arching my back before the flickering flame, scratching behind my ear. You've got the cream, melded into every drop. I will bide my time till you separate and strain you through wire mesh. I'm on edge now, about to overflow. Don't sit so self-contained, Snow White and cold. I shall turn the heat up, put the lid on. Watch me.
I really, really wish to see you talking to more utensils. It's going to be so much fun.
Oh, I do that all the time.
I don't know. I had initially thought that when you said you're going to read multiple poems, I was going to say like, oh, this one was my favorite. I think I love all of them, and I think everyone should get Frazil and read through your journey because it's so much fun to see how a poet's craft itself evolves from time and again, from a hinge to a milk pot. I mean, that's some range.
There are other poems about terrorism, about how we treat religion today.
Yeah.
But those are poems that, if you buy the book, my publisher will be very happy.
Those are poems you should read because those are page poems. Those are not supposed to be read out to you. That's something that you make things out of. And I really like this experience that you serve to people on a platter where they can take a pick. And it just shows the amount of range that you've explored over the years.
There is so much to say in our world, isn't there? There's so much that needs to be said.
Correct.
And it's important to say it right. And I'm not sure as a poet we always get it right.
Correct, yeah.
When you're trying to say things. So,
but I feel like at the point and the juncture that we are, even saying becomes an important act as opposed to saying it.
Yes,
right?
your voice needs to be heard. And unfortunately, this is something I feel very strongly about. We still keep hearing that no one's interested in poetry.
Yeah.
And publishers are still saying that no one's going to buy your books. So we have now, luckily, there are many young committed publishers who are putting their own money, poets
Correct,
who are putting their own money into publishing poetry. And that's a very, very positive thing that's happened. But unfortunately, many poets who write do not buy poetry books.
Yeah.
A poetry book does not cost any more than your cup of coffee would.
Yeah.
But people will not buy them. And the other thing I've found is that people who come to events to hear, they want to hear themselves reading.
Yeah.
But the moment it's someone else's turn, they will walk out.
Yeah.
They're
Or
not
they'll
interested.
scroll on their phone, on WhatsApp.
And I think that is just such a shame because so many people today are interested in poetry. So many people are writing poetry. I've always believed that if the people who write poetry also buy poetry books, the publishers cannot anymore say that no one's interested and no one's going to buy the books. Because that itself is going to be a huge market out there.
Most definitely. I think people are more leaning towards self-publishing than buying. Because when you publish, you need somebody to buy it. So you got to take the first step.
But when you're self-publishing also, you need to be very careful what you're putting out there.
Yeah.
You may not always, the same, like I said, the same poem will get praise and criticism.
Yeah.
But that's okay. There's a lot of half-baked criticism out there.
Yeah.
The same poem people will say they love it. There are others who will say it's the worst poem in the book. It has happened to me. And I think it's okay because finally, what are you comfortable with?
Yeah. I think you just got to watch the pot simmer.
Yes.
And talk to it sometimes.
Yes. And you have to figure out if that voice is really your voice. Yeah. Whether you want it to be any stronger, whether it needs to be any stronger. But that's also the exciting thing about writing poetry because it's all about finding your voice. You're inspired by other poets, but at the end of the day, you need to find what you stand for in the way that you write.
And also stand for it, really firmly. Hold on to that one hinge that keeps you hinged to it.
Yes, but what happens is that when you think you found your voice, and you will evolve, hopefully, and your voice will change, so you're back to square one trying to figure out if that voice is working or not. And that's what makes it both frustrating and exciting.
Correct. I agree. And this has been such a brilliant conversation. We've gone from discovering your poetry, writing poetry, compiling an anthology, talking about underrated voices, to even talking to milk pots and talking about hinges and spring cleaning. So ma'am, where can we find you online? Where can we find your books? What is out in print? What can we buy?
The latest book is Frazil. Frazil is actually a collection of poems from the earliest. So they were actually poems that I did not publish in my first book in this collection because at that time I thought they did not deserve to be in the book. But then as I grew older, I said, why not, So these are poems from 1980 to 2017. It is published by Poetry Wala, Hemant and Smriti Drivate, who have brought out more than 100 books. They are very committed to poetry.
They're one of my next guests, set of
wonderful.
Wish list of guests include both of them.
Wonderful, because they have done so much for poetry and poets. So actually this book came about because Hemant told me that,
you should compile.
He said it's not available anywhere. Your books have been out of print for so long and, we need to get it all together.
Correct.
So Frazil is available on Amazon. It's also available on the Poetry Wala website.
Yeah, we'll put links to both in the description below.
And there is another book which they had published in 2015 called Safe House.
Okay.
So I think that would also be available. It's much slimmer. It was my first book in 14 years.
Wow.
And some of those poems are in Frazil because that is like a collection.
Correct.
But so you will find my poems there. I'm sure my publishers will be very happy if you bought not just this book but also other books that they have published.
Most definitely. Yeah. It's the spirit of yours that you keep giving on, that it just completes an entire circle where you've learned so much from the community and you give back to the community always. And that's probably the reason why a lot of poets actually who have been published, who have been page poets, still have a community that's so thriving because you keep giving back to each other, to the community, and that means a lot. Thank you so much for coming down. This conversation means the world to me.
Thank you, Laxmi. I enjoyed it, and I think you are doing fantastic work trying to put together platforms for poetry and podcasts, and it's wonderful. It's people like you who keep my hope going that nobody can say that people are not interested in poetry.
Yeah.
People are interested, and people like you keep the flag flying.
Thank you so much. And please buy Frazil, and do let us know how did you like it, if you found it through the podcast and if you find it interesting. And just read more poetry. It's literally out there, one click away. Go for it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Karthik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.
Hi, I'm Satyajit.
Hi, I'm Racheta.
We are from the Open Library Project and we host a podcast called Paperback.
Paperback is a podcast where we engage with stalwarts and experts from various industries, suggesting non-fiction titles that contributed to their journey in a big way.
We've had guests like Anjali Raina, Dr. Marcus Rani, Dr. Swati Lodha, Ambi Parmeswaran, Apurva Damani, and many more on our show Paperback. Find new episodes every Wednesday on IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.